Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. If you wander east from Soho to Covent Garden in central London, you will find the streets eerily deserted. For this is January 2021. We are in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. The network of thoroughfares and passages, little courtyards, all around Covent Garden, normally so bustling with tourists and Londoners out at theatres, eating and drinking, or shopping in the wonderful Inigo Jones designed 17th and 18th century market buildings, are all elsewhere. If you'd been walking down these streets 45 years ago, in January 1976, you may have found it similarly deserted, though in a very different way and for very different reasons. For Covent Garden Market at that time, which had been for hundreds of years London's fruit and veg market, had recently been abandoned and all the market holders moved to a fancy new market down in Vauxhall, south of the river. So the old market, which we know and love so well, which very nearly was demolished, thank heaven it wasn't, would have felt rather deserted and gloomy and somewhat run down. But if you'd walked up to Neal Street, which runs north from the market, and started to walk down that narrow cobbled road, you might have noticed a knot of curious young people gathered excitedly outside one particular building on the left. And as you approached, if you're an older person, you might have been quite alarmed by the look of some of these young people. Spiky hair, brightly coloured hair, strange clothes in tatters, with cuts in them and zips and slips, military bondage wear. They may have even turned at you and snarled a bit. But they were just young kids, out for fun, desperate to get into this building. It used to be a gay or transvestite club, but it had recently been taken over by two young groovers. It was rechristened the Roxy, and it had become the venue for this growing scene of what was going to be called punk rock. Now, as you know, the Bureau of Lost Culture is dedicated to collecting, to broadcasting rare, half-remembered, lost stories from the underground, oral testimonies from the counterculture. And you can't really talk about counterculture without talking about youth culture and club culture. And today, in the first of a two-parter, I'm very pleased to welcome two guests who've been instrumental in London's club culture, in London's counterculture since those heady days on Neal Street. They actually met in a club when they were 16 in Streatham in South London 55 years ago, to the very day that this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture is first broadcast, on January the 17th. They've been a couple for all that time and they're still together. In the 1980s, in Brixton in South London, they opened a club called The Fridge, which in its two incarnations flourished through the 80s, 90s and noughties, and many people consider to be one of the most groundbreaking clubs in the London club scene, with various innovations and inspirations that other clubs adopted. But we're going to talk about that club, The Fridge, with them on another occasion. Today we're here to talk about the Roxy, the club that opened on Neal Street in Covent Garden 45 years ago, a club which they opened, or a club which they took over and ran for 100 days, 100 nights, and a club where most of the bands who became famous in the punk scene played. They are Andrew Chesovsky and Susan Carrington. And first of all, I'm going to welcome Susan. Hello, Susan.
Hello there, Stephen.
Welcome to the Bureau, Susan. Before we get into punk and the Roxy and even the Fridge and all that sort of stuff, counterculture, why don't we start off with you two? You two have been together for a very long time. Why don't you tell us about that and how you met and how you've stayed together all that time?
It is rather a long time. Yes, we met in 1966 on a mod night in a place called the Lacana on Streatham High Road. It was a dance hall, and every Monday they had a mod night. So all the sort of young, sweet young things would all meet up. No alcohol was involved. And I don't know, I was still at school. I don't even know how I got to school the next day. And it was just the place to be at the time. And they had a revolving stage and they had a dream time. around about midnight, I think, or maybe 11. I think we had to be home by 12.
What's the dream time?
Put a spotlight on people dancing on the dance floor. And one of that spotlight hit me and Andrew. Our eyes met for 16, and that was it, basically.
So you'd not been eyeing him up for a while. That was the first time that you met.
No, that very night. I think it was January the 17th, 1966, to be precise. And then we went out clubbing to other places. The Ram Jam, which was in Brixton, which then became the first fridge in the 80s. We went there on the opening night, August 6th, 1966, with the Animals. And that was stone's throw from where Andrew lived in Brixton. I was a bus ride away, I think, where I lived in Eastleigh Market, Walworth.
Right, so you two are proper Londoners, South Londoners, right?
We are definitely South Londoners, without question.
And you were both into that sort of bourgeoisie mod scene?
Well, not thoroughly into it. I wouldn't go that far. But we probably in those days would address towards that kind of thing. I mean, I used to make my own outfits, like mini skirts, check, black and white check, and used to make a hat to match. And Andrew would have a suit made at Brixton Tailor from mohair, green shoes, pocket handkerchief to match, little goatee beard. But we never did the scooter and, bashing people up on Brighton Pier. Not quite like that. It was purely fashion, music, going to exciting, interesting places, colour, light, other people. Just loved it.
But I mean, that's youth culture, isn't it? I mean, that's what young people want to do. But what about London at that time? I mean, was London sort of swinging and super exciting and bright lights and all that?
No, it was dark, bleak, miserable. We went to the worst schools in the world. I went to one at Elephant and Castle. We lived in a council flat in East Street Market, which I hated. Andrew's family lived in quite a nice house in Brixton. Got to remember, before Brixton as it is now, we were talking about lots of immigrants and council, Polish, second generation. Poor, it was poor. The market, pretty grim. So me and Andrew, when we met, we actually were both looking for colour, light, entertainment, fun.
Right, and that sort of defines you and your working life in a way, as we're going to come on to, right, with club life, right? So you are two young, groovy, well-dressed, cool kids.
That's right.
So tell us what happens next. I mean, you started to grow up. You're sort of teenagers growing up together in the late 60s.
I was 16 when we met, 17, that's 66. I became 17 in March. So I was still at school. I think Andrew was doing temporary jobs here and there, but not really a proper job. And then I went to Teachers Training College, I think round about 68, whoops. I didn't really want to teach. I just wanted not to go to work. I didn't want to be that working class girl pushing a pram, ever. And so for always looking for something more interesting, basically, for what we were taught at school we were supposed to be. But it was really, we loved music. And it didn't have to be one. We've never been a slave to a particular type of music.
Right, and I mean, you've been involved with lots of different types of music through your times. And of course, the first famous club that you were involved with, the Roxy, became very much associated with that sort of growing punk scene in London. So how did we get there from late 60s?
Me and Andrew moved into the house we still live in, albeit only half of it as a flat, in 1971. And I tried to do this domesticity, baking cakes, mousy hair, Laura Ashley, grim. I was at college with a person you probably know called John Crevine. John Crevine had a stall in Antiquarius called Acme Attractions. It became huge.
Right, so that was the store. Antiquarius was the sort of antiques market off King's Road, and Acme Attractions was still selling sort of second-hand and adapted clothes like Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, right? And then it obviously went on to become really important part of that whole punk fashion scene. I love this quote from Boy George. "We'd try the clothes on in Acme Attractions, fluffy fake fur jumpers with plastic see-through breast panels, rubber tops and trousers. I wanted plastic dungarees, but they looked horrible. I got my mum to copy the clothes, tight black t-shirts with zips across the nipples. I should open my own shop," she said. "This stuff takes 5 minutes to make." So you were there, right?
I started working part-time before I got a job designing a cosmetic range called Tube Cosmetics. And you did the bookkeeping for them. And at that time, I think it was 74, 75, and lots of bands were forming. You had the Sex Pistols with Vivian and Malcolm, and then you had the Clash. Anyway, there was another band called Chelsea, and with the lead singer Gene October. And then Andrew managed them for a while, and the whole point that the Roxy came about was because Andrew was looking for a club that he could put the band on. Remember this whole thing about the Anarchy tour, and punk was banned all over the world. So the Roxy, which was called Shagaramas, was an old rent boys club, sort of tranny rent boys, rock and roll, sort of tiny venue in Neal Street, Covent Garden. And Gene October, who was a singer of Chelsea, used to go there, and he knew the owners, and that's how that first booking came in December, which Andrew will fill you in.
And here he is. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Stephen.
Welcome to the Bureau. Andrew, Susan's given us this wonderful whirlwind tour through you guys meeting and your love of music, Bright Lights and London club scene, and then on into the 70s, meeting people like McLaren and Westwood and Acme Attractions on the King's Road and all that scene that's going on. So take us on from there to the Roxy.
When we started looking towards the newer generation of bands, which will be essentially the Pistols as a sort of the breaking point, because I was out of a job at the time, just looking, we never had a proper job anyway, but just sort of looking for things. So this was almost pre-punk, so we weren't drawn to punk because it didn't sort of exist.
Didn't have a name then, did it?
It was just young bands, and you could see that they were
different style,
had a different style, a different sound,
energy,
and a different look.
Fabulous.
And they were just that little bit younger than what was previously called the pub rock circuit.
Yeah, and so there's the new music coming, as you said before, not called punk yet, but of course you were involved with Malcolm and Vivian Westwood, who of course were, themselves very much part of what was to happen next, right? So tell us about that.
That's right. It was a pre-scene thing. There was no consciousness about it, other than you were all trying to find an alternative path. You didn't know where it went or how it started, but you weren't connected or with the current path, which is the post sort of glam rock period and post hippie period, etc. You weren't part of that. Although we lived through it, we personally enjoyed it all. We still wanted something new and fresh.
Yeah, that's the whole point. Something new and fresh. That's exactly it. I sound like a vampire, don't I?
It's a makeup.
I do actually.
She taught how to make up.
Put a stake through her heart. So how did this whole scene, the music and the style, the fashion, and how did it become called punk? How did that come about?
What we've seen over the years is that you have a sort of an alternative movement, and they all were from Bill Haley to the Beatles to the hippies and whatever. They were in their early formative days. They were the alternative direction, and in time they have to become mainstream. They have to be replaced. That's a standard cycle. So because this was all knocking around in 75, 76, it was proto-punk, I suppose. It hadn't been coined until Caroline Coon, Melody Makers, and Sounds, and they got hold of it. And often the younger journalists would come and review it because they were given the shitty jobs, obviously. Who wants to come and see an unknown band in a smelly pub? Whereas the more well-established journalists were touring with Led Zeppelin. That's normal stuff. So they're the ones who came along and saw it in a new light and gave it this name, punk.
Right, so that came afterwards, really. We interviewed Barry Kane, who I know you guys know, and he was working for Record Mirror, just as a young man reviewing the music, the pop scene, as it were. And then he got assigned to be the Record Mirror's punk correspondent and was sent off to see these bands and the bands that you mentioned then. In fact, I remember he said that he saw the Stranglers, and his first thing was that these are older guys. They can play their instruments and stuff. They didn't seem like punks, but he was monitoring that and writing about it and stuff. But he said that it was a very small thing, and of course it only lasted a couple of years. So for you, how did you get much more involved? You've been doing the accounts for McLaren and Westwood, and then you become artist manager.
Yeah, that's a bit glamorous, actually. I'm not qualified. I never went to school or college.
But you can add up.
I'm not an accountant. I'm more just a bookkeeper, and I can add from 1 to 10 million quite easily. So I'm okay.
And purely, you became manager purely by chance, wasn't it?
It's all chance. It's all accident.
Yeah.
People actually rewrite their histories. Whole countries do it. Whole political parties do it. They rewrite the history that they want people to believe. They never tell the truth. You have this sort of vague direction that you want to go in, but it's usually like 100 doors in front of you. You choose one, and it goes 10 feet in. You choose another one, it goes a mile in, and so on. And then eventually you find one that keeps on going, and you keep following it.
Right. So nice metaphor. So these doors are opening, or you're opening them, and then you end up becoming manager for Generation X and the Damned, right?
Well, before, I met the Damned again. They were one of the faces.
Generation X.
They were sort of like some of the faces that were around the circuit, going to the Pistols concerts and the early Clash concerts and so on. So again, there's only 3 or 4 dozen people involved in this. So you sort of vaguely knew each other because it's not difficult to recognise someone from 50 people. And I was working actually for the boys' shop, sort of doing a bit of bookkeeping, not accountancy, just tidying things up. And it was a hot summer's day in Notting Hill, where they had a second shop. The main one was on King's Road. And it was Brian James
and Chris Miller.
And Chris, Ratscabius, who were just walking down the road, and they said, "Oh, hi, Andy." We said, "Oh, hi." Just, got to chatting, what you're doing, etc. And they said they were rehearsing around the corner. And they said, "Oh, we're looking for a manager." And simply by association of hanging around and knowing Malcolm and Vivian and the Pistols indirectly, we're never in each other's pockets in any shape or form. And I thought, well, if Malcolm can do it, I'm sure I can.
Very good. Well, if Malcolm can do it, I'm sure I can. I'm sure he would have approved of that sort of attitude, wouldn't he? He did sort of redefine what it meant to be a music manager. I think I read something about he saw it in terms of music management in terms of the audience, not the band, which was probably pretty radical at the time. And he certainly managed record companies that were involved with Sex Pistols very well. But you were involved with the Damned then as manager, but I think it was fairly brief, wasn't it? So how did it all come to an end?
We met, was it April 76? That's right. And I did a bit of their management, sorted things out, got some dates, rehearsals, got tapes up to the record companies, etc. I managed to get them on the Marc de Marsan, which is the first punk rock festival in south of France, put on by Marc Zermatt. That's right. Anyway, so he asked us to go on this punk rock tour. Of course, I signed him up, and off we went. Now, when we got on the coach, it was quite clear there were no punks on the coach but us. You had the Gorillaz, Dave Edmunds, Nick Lowe, Pink Fairies, somebody else. Anyway, so you got old pub bands managed by Jake Riviera from Stiff Records. So we, the punks, sat at the back of the coach with the journalists, Caroline Coon and John Ingham. That's right. And then you had a gap of about 10 rows of sheets, and all the other bands were at the front with the coach driver. Anyway, so on the way down, they were taking speed and a beer and a cheap lager and all the rest of it. We stopped overnight, carried on, did the festival, and we were on about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, quite early. There's just like 200 people in a 10,000 capacity bull ring, and they were already flying high. They'd all had their, speed and everything. But they went on, and they went through this set so fast because it was only a short set anyway. It lasted like 20 minutes, so they did it all again. Oh dear. Anyway, no one took any notice because there was nobody there.
Didn't Cat Sempston almost?
He jumped off of a stack of speakers, I think, or something like that, and poleaxed himself. He jumped onto literally a scaffold pole between his legs and fell off that. Oh,
he's not got over that.
And Mark Zamatti, who was the promoter, he was like shooting heroin by then, because we went to him for some money, because £30 is a lot of money. And he said, well, here's like £5, I'll give you the rest later. And I'm thinking, oh, all right.
And then they sacked you, right?
No, well, so that was that. And I got fed up with them. They were running amok. They were listening to reason.
Got kicked out of the hotel.
We got thrown out of the hotel. So we got woken up at 3 a.m. because they wouldn't go to sleep because the speed was still working. Running up and down the hallways, knocking on doors. I mean, stupid stuff. I managed to get a room way away from them. But the manager found me, woke me up and said, get out. Oh.
But on the coach back...
So we got on. So the coach picked us up at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. We had managed to get them in, have some breakfast, got on the coach. They sort of fell asleep, and then they woke up later in the afternoon, and it started off again. And the day started. When I say they, that was, who was it? I think it was Chris and
That's
Captain,
Davis.
yeah, who was now mixing with Jake Riviera, who was like a proper man. He would take speed and drink brandy. So an hour later, they walk up and say, "Sorry, Andy, Jake's gonna manage us now."
Wow.
I thought, oh, good luck.
Right, so that's quite brutal, I suppose. But I mean, it doesn't sound like it bothered you that much, Andrew.
I wasn't the right person for them. They wanted someone more like Brian Grant. Is it Brian Grant, Led Zeppelin manager?
Peter Grant.
Peter Grant from Led Zeppelin. You wanted someone like that who shouted and screamed and punched out record company executives. It wasn't my style, but that's what they thought a manager should do.
Well, I guess everybody was making it up at the time. That scene. I recently interviewed Peter Jenner, who, along with Andrew King, was the person who discovered Pink Floyd in the 60s and became their first manager. But he'd been a lecturer at London School of Economics, and he saw them playing and thought, a bit like you, I want to get involved with this. He loved music. And he became the manager. But at some point, he obviously thought, I better find out what a music manager does. And he happened to be living with one of the musicians from the Soft Machine, and they had a manager. So he asked him, what does a manager do? And the guy said, ask Henry. And he was like, what? And he said, ask Henry. He said, whenever anybody asks us any questions, we just say, ask Henry. Henry was their manager. So if you want to know what a manager does, ask Henry.
Well, that's
in reality,
because you do have to think on your feet. You make it up as you go along. The record companies don't know what they're doing. Nobody knows what they're doing. All they're looking for is the next big hit so they can make a pile of money and get in the papers and be famous for discovering somebody. So it's a very simple thing, and you make it or you don't, and
Right. So let's circle back to the Roxy. You've stumbled into artist management, as it were, and you end up opening this club running this club in Covent Garden. Now, Covent Garden, for anybody who's not in London, is smack in the centre of town. It's also now a very kind of posh, boutique-y tourist market, basically. Lovely buildings and stuff, but it wasn't always like that, was it?
Covent Garden was the thriving fruit and veg centre, flower centre of London, and therefore essentially of the UK. But that started to... it got so big and so overcrowded and so inefficient, because don't forget, it was built 300 years ago, in the Georgian period, that it wasn't big enough to cope with the demands of London. So in the late 60s, early 70s, there was this proposal to sort of move it, and this went on, as always with political people, went on for years and years and years, and eventually they moved to Nine Elms, which is south of the river. Covent Garden was empty. All the shops, all the spaces, nothing was happening at all because nothing's that efficient. So it became a very desolate and dark area. They weren't prepared to let it out to anybody. Nobody really wanted it because nothing was happening. This was pre Covent Garden, you know now. Neal Street is really on the edge of Covent Garden and on the edge of Soho. It's on that little boundary between the two almost. And in 72 or 4, I can't remember exactly. What's his name? Is it Neil Holt?
John Holt.
I think it's John Holt, English reggae star, not the Jamaican type. Very sort of soft. Anyway, he made a pile of money, and I think he was gay, but don't hold it to that one. And he, with his success, he bought a small Covent Garden basement ground floor. I think it was a potato warehouse. So most of them were of some sort or another, and turned it into what was to be called Shagaramas, which is named after a bay in Jamaica. Okay, so it's as simple as that. But it didn't last very long. I don't think it was his forte. Running a club, you've got to be dedicated. It's not a part-time job. And this is why a lot of rich people do it, but they can't keep it going. It became certainly a tranny gay sort of piano-type bar when it was taken over by the people who had it when we got involved. A barrister who dealt with licensing, he must have jumped in on it when either they went broke or something must have happened. He took over. He was gay. Obviously, his boyfriend was gay. And so that's the way it went. But he also apparently represented sort of hardcore East End criminals. So you had this classic crossover of transvestite gay boys and criminals. Some people get up on that, apparently.
Apparently, yeah. So your idea was just to have one night there for Generation X as a one-off.
Yeah, we had all it was. My job was to, as a manager, to get them a record deal, get them work, get them touring, get them playing their music. That's my job. It was very simple. But because of the whole Anarchy Pistols tour fiasco, absolutely everybody was shitting a brick because they could lose their licenses if they put on a punk band. That was the threat. And obviously no licensee pub club would want to lose their license. You're out of business overnight.
And it's absolutely amazing, isn't it, thinking back on it, that one band, the Pistols, and this tour, the Anarchy tour, could cause such a uproar in the media and nationally speaking that it would have that effect across venues. They'd be actually afraid to put on these so-called punk bands in case they got closed down. It was amazing, right? So you had to find a way around that.
Through Gene, who was a rent boy at the time, Gene October from Chelsea. He knew that the owners, and he got a date for Chelsea which was sometime sort of late September, October time. It was pre the whole Pistols fiasco, but by the time the fiasco had happened, Gene had actually sort of been kicked out of the band, and Tony James and Billy came to me and said, "Look, we want to get rid of Gene. What do you think?" I said, "Fine. I don't think he's right, and we should rearrange them and put Billy on the vocals." I said, "That's the right thing to do," and brought in a new guitarist, which is Durwood. So they became Generation X. So I obviously went back to the owners of what was then Shagaramas and said, "Look, it's not going to be Chelsea. Gene's not involved, but we still want to do it as Generation X." And of course they said, "Sure, fine. Where's the money?" Because that's all they were interested in. And we discovered afterwards that they weren't bothered about losing a license because they didn't actually have one.
But we didn't know that.
But we didn't know that, you see. They did because they knew about the law and they were barristers, etc. So they were happy. They got 150 quid cash, and we get to put the date on with Generation X, despite this so-called ban on punk. And even though we had never actually played, we were within that, headline as it titled, because all the friends and fans of the band were all other members of all those other bands.
Right, I mean, that's how scenes start, isn't it, really? Before they've even got a name, as you said earlier, before it's even called punk, you've got a bunch of kids, basically, who are hanging out together, and they're all in bands, playing in each other's bands and coming to see each other's bands. So if you put on a gig, it's your mates turn up.
Yeah.
And then you go and see them, and then it starts to turn into something.
Yeah, that's right. Because you were just friends. There's more friends than fans at that stage. You just, hey, Brian's playing down the road. Should we go and see him? Yeah, okay. Billy's playing. You going to see Billy? Sure, let's go and see Billy. And you did tend to know each other. Because don't forget, the Roxy only held officially, I think it was 150 was the capacity. But because of the Pistols fiasco, the whole idea of punk sort of grew up, and that's giving out flyers. There was this sort of increased interest in that type of music, and on the opening night, we fortunately had a sellout, so I achieved my job as a manager.
History in the making. So, Susan, do you remember that first night?
Of course I do.
Well, tell us about it. I mean, what was it like?
Oh, wow. I think we were so worn out, to be quite honest. Because you've got to remember, when we actually hired what became the Roxy from the Shagaramas, there was no drink in there, no glasses, nothing. It was a complete tip, basically. So I had a job at the time, and I had a company minicar. So we went to the East End for cash and carry, and loaded up the minicar, with cans of beer and stuff. And they were building. There wasn't a stage there, so you'd have Billy Idol trying to bang a nail in a piece of wood. That was funny, and there was just a whole sort of team spirit, I'd say you call, and that was pretty. Well, we were so surprised people actually came, but as Andrew said, it was all really word of mouth. So they all sort of knew each other, and so it was quite electric.
And then the very next thing that you put on is Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers. Tell us about that, Andrew. How that came about.
When I was handing out flyers around, Soho, Covent Garden. I mean, there's only a few places that you actually went and gave out flyers because you just knew that the right people were there from the tiny little record shops or a pub or whatever. And I was handing out flyers for Generation X, and was walking up and down Wardour Street, and the famous Ship, which is where all the bands used to hang out prior to the Marquee. I was walking past there, and out on the street was Lee Black Childers, who I didn't know, and Malcolm McLaren. And Malcolm, obviously, I knew. I said, hi, Malcolm, how are things, what's going on? Usual stuff. And I said, here's a flyer, come and see them. And he said, great. And then Lee said, what's that? I said, it's a new club we're putting on. By that time, it was the Roxy, because, again, unbeknown to us, the Shagaramas people were in liquidation, had gone broke. So they had to change the name. So when we actually firmed up the booking with the flyers, it changed its name to the Roxy. Nothing to do with us. Again, pure chance.
Yeah, but a lot better name than Shagaramas.
More suited, but because it was only a one-off gig to promote Gen X and nothing else, it really didn't matter. Because we were going to do a gig and go. So I met Malcolm, and, he did the usual looking down at you. And Lee was there saying, oh, my, what's this? Can we play there? And I knew that by then that he was the manager of the Johnny Thunders and Heartbreakers. I said, well, yeah, that's because I was pretty sure that the owners would let me hire another date. So I said to him, sure, well, let's try and work out a date. And because in those days, there was no texting, there was no mobiles. You had to phone. There's no other way to speak. So we did a date, tied it up in principle. And he said, I said, how much do you want? He said £100. I said, I can't afford £100. If everybody paid a sort of £1 to get in, it would just about cover the cost of the band, never mind the hire of the venue, which is £150, the PA, usual stuff. And anyway, I've only got like 4 days to promote it because it was going to be after the date of the Generation X. So he said, well, how much can you pay us? I said, well, £30. He said, all right, if you give me half now, which I thought. So they went to one of the first ATMs. So I went there and picked up £15, went straight back to him, gave him the 15 and said, I'll see you next week. And that was the end of it.
Very trusting for a manager.
Well, because but they were desperate to play because, again, everybody was pushing this myth of you're not allowed to play. You're a punk band. You can't do this. You can't do that. But the idea of having the Heartbreaker was brilliant. So got them in, and booked them in, got some flyers, stuff like that, gave those around over the next few days. Plus, my big thing was to, on the date that we had Generation X, which is the sole purpose of my job to promote them, which we had a full house, which were lucky 150 odd people, we were able to announce to them that obviously Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers are playing tomorrow night. And of course, there you've got 150 committed music fans who know all about that. They would have followed the whole fiasco of the tour and would have had a first chance to see the Heartbreakers, which they never had before. So they came in, and of course, a full house, and it was terrific. One of the best dates that we had.
Right. I mean, so you're on a roll then, right? So you just kept going, right?
Well, then I'm thinking on my feet once again. Well, I've got Gen X on. That was a success. If I've got Johnny Thunders on, then why don't I put Gen X on again the following week? And use the Heartbreakers date to promote the Next Generation date. So that was the idea there, thinking, right, the more the merrier. You're getting closer to Christmas. And so we did the second date. And that worked again, another full house, because once again, this underground new club, and it's putting on punk. No, you mustn't tell anybody. But you just tell your friends.
And with Susie and the Banshees.
They were supporting.
Right, so it really was sort of history in the making. I mean, the amazing thing is, we're recording this in December. I mean, it was 44 years ago. That really does feel like history, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're very conscious of, when we speak to people, we've got to think to ourselves, like, when we were 20, and I spoke to people during the war, we thought they were old, past it. And I'm sure they think about us the same, young people.
I mean, it's interesting with the whole punk thing, because it's been so much, a couple of years ago particularly, all the retrospectives, the exhibitions, the V&A, all the kind of talks, the books and everything. And as Barry Kane said, and as you said, it was a couple of years and a few people, really. It has been mythologized, possibly even over mythologized, but by people who weren't there.
Yeah.
But back to 76, I mean, it was quite mythic in a way, wasn't it? Because New Year's Day comes and you get off the New Year to a rocket with a certain band called The Clash.
And that was mad. That was because, we squeezed like 300 people into a club that held 150.
I mean, yeah, so Susan, talk a little bit about that, because, punk's famous for its sort of DIY ethos. And here, at the Roxy Club, that was very much the case, wasn't it? You said about you having to rush around getting booze and knocking the stage together and all that sort of stuff. And it must have been pretty hectic if you're putting these nights on just on the spur of the moment. It
was mad. And don't forget, 1977, January the 1st, nothing was open to get alcohol and stop the bar up, because in those days, nothing was open. And we found, as I said before, the cash and carry in the East End, that we just got there 3:00 in the afternoon, just before they closed, to get beer again for the company car. And but it was quite evident by this time that we preferred running a club rather than managing a band. Which can become extremely
So we had
tiresome.
No experience of doing either of them.
But we loved it because it was putting on a show every night, setting it up. You're either successful or it was a disaster. Sometimes could pay the band, sometimes couldn't, but we managed. You scraped through. And then, of course, you had all the so-called sharks creeping on because they could see the success that we had and they wanted a part of it. Maybe Andrew could feel it.
So the Roxy itself as a club lasted for about 2 years, but you guys who set it up, that was quite a short time, wasn't it? Just 3 or 4 months.
See, we call it our time, which is 100 nights only. But because the owners, the crooked barrister, he could sniff that there was something to be had here. He got other crooks involved, which he knew from the East End, and they brought in a manager who was John McDonald, who's not a crook. He was just around and about. I don't know how he got involved, actually. But he then essentially took over, and then he ran it for another year and a half. But as far as we were concerned, it was all done and dusted.
And right, and what 100 days it was. I mean, that word legendary or mythic is kind of overused, but when it's applied to the Roxy in that time that you were there, I mean, it's quite understandable why people would talk about it in that way now. I mean, listen to this. This is just a list of some of the bands who played there during your time. Generation X, the Buzzcocks, Chelsea, Wayne County, The Damned, The Jam, The Lurkers, Johnny Moped, The Only Ones, The Police, they did all right, Sham 69, Susie and the Banshees, Slaughter and the Dogs, The Slits, The Stranglers, Subway Sect, Wire, X-Ray Specs, XTC. That's just the ones that I recognise. There's a lot of others, they're probably famous punk bands that I didn't recognise. And of course that wasn't it either. That was just the ones, you know, the better known ones. So, I mean, that's quite a roster. And, I mean, you know, you really were squeezing them in, weren't you? I mean, and this was a place that all the bands of that era, the punk bands, wanted to play. They wanted to be at the Roxy. I guess it was a combination of that, you know, wanting to play at the place where all these other cool punk bands were playing, and also the fact that there wasn't that much option because of the whole fallout from the Sex Pistols thing.
Yeah, but they had an alternative. We were getting tapes, because in those days it was a tape or maybe a phone call in the post sent to the club, because it was obviously reviewed in the music papers, just arriving out of the blue saying, will you put us on? Well,
if you're a punk band, yes.
We just had a very simple, because you couldn't go to Northampton or Bristol and go and look at them. It just wasn't possible. So we just said, are you a punk band? And they said, yes. And well, then you're on next week. Simple. So it wasn't conscious, but because it was early days, they did become the core, the foundation.
I mean, the adverts, gay advert, they came up from Torquay, I think, or somewhere outside Torquay.
Yeah.
They just rang and said, can we play? Of course you can. And it was electric. And she couldn't play, but she was just, you know, Three Chord Wonders, I think, one of their songs, isn't it? And it's fantastic. And as I say, people used to turn up at the club. They come from school in their school uniforms, go in the toilets, come up with all these amazing outfits that they created, you know, bin liners, safety pins. It was never, while we were there, it was never gory, blood up the walls, all that nastiness that came after. That's not what we were about at all. And up until April the 23rd, 1977, I mean, me and Andrew physically got kicked out by René Albert.
Well, tell us about that. I mean, you know, you've done this thing that's extraordinarily successful in its own terms anyway. And what happened?
Some nights were really bad. We were counting pennies in a late night coffee bar in Soho or something. People couldn't pay the rent, never paid the rent, and that's where the argument started. So maybe Andrew would like to take
and that's why we had a bust up with the barrister, you know, because we had our idea of how things should be done, and it was a lot riskier. And he wanted us to put on disco bands and all sorts of things. He didn't get it at all. He just wanted to get the rent in somehow.
And which he put up. Andrew signed a contract for £300 a week, didn't you?
Yeah, we signed a contract for
really a lot of money.
It was a huge amount of money for us.
You're so naive. We thought we could pay it.
So we paid the first few dates, which was just one night at a time. But when we got to a commitment, which was from January the 1st, then the whole thing changed, because we were responsible for that contract, obviously. We then had to start thinking about filling up the club 7 days a week. Well, that was a stupid thing to try to do. No one ever runs a club 7 days a week. And there weren't the bands to fill it. So within 2 or 3 weeks, we reduced it down to Thursday, Fridays and Saturdays, which then obviously didn't produce enough to pay the rent. And so the whole thing was spiraling out of control.
But the biggest thing that upset them was, I think we had the Damned on a 4-week on a Monday, wasn't it? And they all got quite mad on stage, and Captain Sex was quite tall. And the ceiling was polystyrene, you know, that horrible polystyrene squares or something. And he got his guitar with the, end of it, and smashed the ceiling, and the whole goddamn ceiling fell down. Wires, live wires. Andrew had to run to the electric cupboard and save lives, didn't you?
Oh, we did, yeah, because live cables are hanging out off the ceiling.
And then we got a summons, I think, the next week, didn't we?
Then we got a summons for like £5,000 to repair the ceiling. You've got to understand that's like $50,000 now for a club that holds 150. It wasn't going to happen. So all that got into big arguments, threats and accusations. And eventually the whole thing wasn't looking too good. But at the same time, I had the idea of why don't we record some of these bands and put out an album? Which, when I spoke to Barry, who was our partner, who had a 4-track.
He had this thing about selling out, didn't he?
He had a 4-track recorder, because that's how I got to meet Barry, because we used his studio, which is literally a coal hole. It was under the front of his house. They were squatting. And we used that to do the first Damned demo. So I said, why don't you bring that down and start to record the bands? And it landed up on Mike Thorne's desk at EMI, who produced the first Roxy album, and who went on to produce Soft Cell, The Shirts, many big bands. And so we did a proper record deal and got some proper money, which was £10,000. It was a lot as an advance for not a band, obviously, we weren't a band, to a compilation album of unknown music of unsigned bands. Unbelievable. 5,000 of it went immediately on the hiring of the up-to-date hot shit 24-track mobile recording studio. During that time, I was setting the recording up. Renee, the owner, was threatening to kick us all out, and he said, if you don't pay by tomorrow, you're gone, and all the rest of it. And so we lied and cheated to him and said, yes, no problem. We borrowed the money a bit here, gave him a bit there, because we'd made our commitment to EMI, so we had to get that recording done. So
you caught between a sort of sharkish landlord and EMI Records, who've dropped a huge amount of money on it. I mean, it's quite high pressure stakes now.
It was a high pressure stake, and they didn't know. We didn't tell anybody. We just kept pulling the wool over Rene's eyes, because we said, a couple more days to go, just got to put the bands in, and then he can bugger off. So we got the recording, and that was it. We separated from the Rene and the Roxy probably about a week after the recording, and that was it. But we had the tapes.
Yeah, well, that's really important, isn't it? We were talking earlier, the thing about clubs, club nights, events. You can put a huge amount of effort, creative energy, money into creating a wonderful evening, a wonderful event, or a festival. But of course, it's gone. It's ephemeral, isn't it? So it is great, actually, if something tangible comes out of that, which you can kind of sell, obviously, but also is like, the memory of that time and that place is kind of captured. But obviously, the Roxy after your time carried on, but not with the same spirit. I mean, this is interesting. This is a quote from Joe Strummer of The Clash, talking about the Roxy later. And he says, the only thing that could count as a scene is the Roxy. And the Roxy's a dormitory. The last time I went, I was feeling really uppity. I stood in the middle and looked around, and all these people were slumped around, dozing. And I threw tomato sauce on the mirror and stormed out. And I haven't been back there since. I don't think I will go back there. The sooner it closes, the better. That's quite damning. And, if you see Julian Temple's film about The Clash, which has got footage from that New Year's Day show, with you guys, it's full on. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, it really captures the spirit, I imagine, of what it was like. Definitely no social distancing in the crowd. And The Clash themselves are on full frontal attack form. And it sounds pretty terrible, but the vibe is like massively up there. So something obviously changed between that show and his last visit to the club after you guys are gone. But it did kickstart or help kickstart the thing which was called punk for journalists, for record labels, for agents, and it became a national then an international phenomenon, didn't it? Right?
Yeah, because we got a huge amount of press, whether because of what we were doing. Because what other bands were doing and forming, and I think they were beginning to get some tours in.
Right. Yeah, but it was called punk. I mean, it was a lot of different sounds, actually, wasn't it? A lot of different bands, really.
There is no such thing as a punk band, actually, because if you listen to the Pistols, the Stranglers,
I think the Clash,
the Damned, and Wire, they come under this huge umbrella. They were just around at the time, but I don't see any commonality in the music. But if you had to say, which ones were punk bands, you'd say mostly the Damned, I'd say, more than any of them.
The energy that they had is incredible.
But, again, it was a fluid umbrella.
Well, talking about fluid, the other person who's definitely worth mentioning in the context of you and the Roxy and his influence on punk, I guess, and on, you know, quite a few people in the punk world, especially the Clash, I guess, West London thing, is Don Letts. He was the DJ at the Roxy that you introduced. Is that right?
Donovan, I knew through, because he was like the
manager of
Boy Boutique Boy Shop in King's Road. They'd have a jukebox down there in the shop because it suited the atmosphere, obviously, and the stuff that they were doing. And he just brought his own records down, used to play them. And so all day he was spinning his own records. It was right across the board, his music, so he very broad taste. And when I booked Generation X to do the Roxy and stuff, you know, I had too much on my plate to do anything. So I asked him, I said, will you play? He said, no, I don't play. You know, I'm not a DJ, and no, I can't do that, etc. And I kept talking to him. I thought there's nothing much to do. Just bring some records down. And you're just playing to a few friends. You know most of the people around and about anyway, the faces. You know, it's only going to be 50, 60 people. It's just like a home party. And he sort of said, all right then, reluctantly. And he said, on condition you pay for the taxi from where he lived, which was way down in South London, into Forest Hill, South London, up into Covent Garden and back again, so that he could bring with him 50 albums or whatever. But once again, not punk albums. There was no such thing.
And he bought his reggae collection.
So he bought a reggae collection and mixed it in, and he mixed it in with a bit of Stooges, a little bit of Bowie, a bit of Lou Reed. You know, you get the MC5, and a little bit of reggae. And that's where, because of my connection, you have this reggae punk culture clash.
And also the reggae was a bit softer and smoother before the thrash.
I mean, see, because reggae was an alternative sound as well.
Right, and so an important part of the whole punk thing, as we said, and with Don Letts obviously making his films as well, which made part of that whole era, recorded part of that whole era. So for you guys, the Roxy's over, and, you know, you've put all this energy and time, love, money, resources, ideas and stuff into it, and then, you know, because of the issues with the landlord and money and all that sort of stuff, it comes to an end. I mean, was that devastating, or, you know, to do all that and then for it to stop or be stopped from doing it?
No, we were so fed up with the whole thing. We had, you know, threats, we had pressure, we had summonses delivered to our home in Streatham. We
wanted to do something
because we were working day and night. We were deciding flyers, we were booking the bands, we were getting the press, cleaning the place itself. You know, it just went on, and with no financial backing at all. So by the time we got the record done with, we weren't all that sorry, frankly.
I mean, that's kind of the story anyway, isn't it? Counterculture, you know, things start off underground and then they sort of gradually go overground. It's always been that way, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not uncommon, but, you know, the scene was growing, agents were doing stuff, the bands were touring. Someone even put together a Roxy Club tour, you know, of some of the bands that weren't even playing there.
Well, some of those bands went on to be pretty big. I mean, the Police, crikey. I mean, you know, the Clash, the Jam. They were pretty good, right?
We didn't think so at the time. I say some horrible things in that book about the Jam.
Go on, tell.
They were a mod band. They weren't punks, which they were. But look what's happened. I'm sure they care.
Well, listen, let's talk a bit about the book. So it's The Roxy, Our Story, the club that forged punk in 100 nights of madness, mayhem and misfortune. Punk rock was the ultimate anti-movement, anti-fashion, anti-rock, anti-establishment. Its bands consisted of players untrained in music looking to explode the heavy, overproduced rock of the previous generation, stripping music down to its core. The music was banned from every venue and club in the United Kingdom from fear that it might dissolve the remains of unity. In the fragile political backdrop of the time, the Roxy Club stood alone in its wish to promote this music against all odds. It survived just 100 nights, but during its short reign, cut through the pomp and self-satisfied operators of the music business, who finally saw that they had no clothes. This very personal book from the diaries and memories of this infamous club by Andrew Chesovsky and his partner Susan Carrington tells how it all came about, looking out from the centre of the maelstrom at the impact they were having during the most crucial 100 nights in punk rock music history. So just tell us a little bit how it came about and, you know, how you put it together.
We were thinking about writing this book for a long time, but it was going to be from memory and stories and even researching ourselves online. But fortunately, discovered that a lot of material in our attic in boxes we didn't even know we had. So Susan's diary is the most important thing, because the Roxy book, our story, is written in sort of a diary form almost. It starts from day one and finishes on day 100, and that was really the backbone, the skeleton of the book. So that's why we sat down, did the book. 2017 16 we had it printed. We designed it, we code laid it out, obviously wrote everything, and we financed the whole thing. Even though we had interest from 2 or 3 publishers, boy, were they slow and boring. I just couldn't take it. Like 2 years passed, I just had enough.
That sounds true to form. Well, that's your whole ethos, isn't it? Though, anyway, sort of do it yourself, get on with it.
Well, we did it in a do-it-yourself style. That was the whole point. We can't hang around. We like to move forward. We're like sharks, going to keep swimming.
Keep swimming. Well, I mean, it is very much your story, rather than a full history, isn't it, Susan?
So some people say, well, you didn't mention this, that, or the other. The whole point, it's our story.
It's not a history of punk.
No.
People say, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention that? But it's not about that. It's about us.
And how it happened, how we enjoyed it, how we eventually didn't like it anymore, and how we eventually got kicked out on the 23rd of April, 1977.
Yeah, a sort of brutal end is apparent in the story, but of course not the end for you at all, as we're going to find out in the next episode. But Susan, when you look back over all those 100 nights, to the extent that you can remember them with all the chaos going on, is there one that sticks in your mind that you thought, that was it, that was the Roxy, really summed it up?
I think Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers for energy and speed, and the fact they wouldn't get off the stage till 2 o'clock in the morning. And the Jane County, it was called Wayne County then. Fabulous, totally over the top. I love them all, to be quite honest.
Yeah, the Jam nights
Not
are pretty.
the Jam. Afraid that was not
10 people, not playing punk. Terrible.
No.
What about you, Andrew? What's your peak moment?
It's the same as Susan. It would be the second opening night, I should say, which was with the Heartbreakers.
Great stuff. Well, we're coming to the end of this episode. We are going to be back with you again. But I wanted to finish up, actually, with another quote from the book, because I thought it sort of, in a way, summed up, in some senses, the connection between nightlife, club culture, youth culture, and the counterculture. And it says, nightclubs have been a fixture of urban life for at least a century. From speakeasies to cellar discotheques, they're the low-lit preserves of the city at play, a place to hold the night at bay. A club should imbue both intimacy and abandon. Although the alchemy for success is unpredictable, the ingredients are simple: music, punters, and alcohol. Countless night spots have succumbed to obscurity. Those back doorways and garish neon signs that once promised so much are long since forgotten in the relentless redevelopment of contemporary cities. Rare are the clubs that make their mark on history. Those few that have left behind an indelible imprint include the Cavern, the Marquee, Whiskey A Go-Go, Max's Kansas City, CBGB's, and the Roxy. So there we have it. Thank you very much, Andrew Chizovsky and Susan Carrington.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen.
Andrew and Susan, an amazing couple. We're going to be back with the story of what happened to them, for them, with them next, and the amazing club that they founded and ran in Brixton, The Fridge, which changed the nightlife scene of London and youth culture in a different sort of way than the Roxy. Do check out their book. It's a wonderful ride through 100 days and nights of punk mayhem. It's a terrific tale. And thanks to you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. You can check us out at bureauoflostculture.com. You can also find all past episodes now on various podcast providers: Apple, Google, TuneIn, Pandora, Listen Notes, Spotify, Amazon, all the usual places. If you've enjoyed it, or this episode or any other, and you feel moved to leave us a review, we'd love that. and to share it with anybody else that you think will enjoy lost, half-remembered, secret, rare, forgotten stories from the counterculture and the underground. See you next time. I'm Stephen Coates.